Thank you, Yoni. Thank you, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. You said the elephant in the room, Yoni, and I think we have a few elephants in the room. We will get to the judicial reform in just a moment, but first I want to ask Simcha Rotman.
Wait for the music to... Yes.
I'm not an elephant in the room. I'm a donkey because I defend Democrats, not Republicans. So.
All right. So, Simcha, not to say that you're an elephant, but you've been the talk of the day in Israel over the past 24 hours, and we want to address this incident in which protesters, some would say an anti-government activist, harassed you on the street, was walking after you for a few blocks here in New York City, shouting in your ear constantly with a megaphone, trying to express, you know, her First Amendment rights, being here in the U.S., she would say. But you seized the megaphone away from her and really grabbed the attention of the press in Israel. What's your comment about this?
It's quite a simple issue, because there were demonstrations outside of the place that we had dinner. No problem with it. As a long-time protester on many issues, I would respect any protest. To go for 10 blocks, for 20 minutes basically, after a couple, I was there with my wife, and use megaphone after we ignored them for a few blocks because they were not using megaphone. Using megaphone in a very close proximity, that's not a demonstration, that's not a protest. That's an attack. That's an attack on me, but because I don't take it personally, of course my wife, but the attack is actually on democracy. And maybe it's connected to the issue that we're talking, judicial reform, because many people claim that if the judicial reform will pass, that will be the end of democracy in the state of Israel. I don't know about any countries that lost its democracy because they changed the way they elect their judges. I don't know, maybe there was. I'm not such an expert in history, I don't know of. I know many countries that lost their democracy because they have small, very small, violent groups that went and harassed elected officials and threatened them until they give up their position, until they give up their views. For that we have many, many examples, and people who don't understand the difference between a protest and a violent attack, they need some crash course in democracy.
So, Mr. Dershowitz, I see that you're nodding here. These two issues are, of course, somewhat intertwined. The issue of free speech, democracy, liberalism, and we'll touch on all of it. You were interviewed several times about the judicial reform in Israel, and you referred to it as a grave mistake. Why is that?
Well, first of all, I offer to defend you if anybody tries to prosecute you for defending yourself and your wife against using a megaphone essentially as a weapon. Under American law, it is permissible to restrict speech based on the loudness of the speech, the proximity of the speaker, time, manner, and location. And so there's no reason why anybody should be able to come up to you and put a megaphone in your ear, and you had the perfect right to prevent that in an orderly and reasonable way. Having said that, I really want to, first of all, commend the Israeli people for the manner in which generally they have conducted these demonstrations. They are a model. There has been very little, if any, violence. It's not like in America, where after the killing of George Floyd, we had massive, massive violence, and we had lawyers throwing Molotov cocktails into police cars. If there's ever a need to prove that Israel democracy will survive this dispute, it's the fact that these demonstrations have gone on now for many, many, many weeks. My own preference is to not allow demonstrations in front of the homes of people like Aaron Barak or the homes of others who are private citizens. It's okay to demonstrate in front of the home of the president, in front of the home of the prime minister. Those are public places. But I don't approve of demonstrating in front of the homes of private citizens, even people who used to hold high positions of power. Having said that, I think both sides have misused the term democracy and have overstated the dangers to Israel if either side prevails. I agree with you that there would not be a danger to democracy if, in fact, the courts were somewhat weakened and didn't have the authority it had today. But I also think that if the courts were strengthened or maintained the way they are, we have democracies, America is an example of that, in which courts make some of the most important decisions, taking them away from the legislature. So my goal, and the reason I insisted that we have a conversation rather than a debate, is to try to bring us closer together. This is exactly the kind of issue that's a matter of degree, and where both sides have to compromise a little bit. Should I just lay out briefly what I think can be done?
but I think let's backtrack just a little because let's circle back to this because people in Israel have been engaged in this fierce public debate over judicial reform for what, like 22 weeks now, 23 weeks,
22 years.
But I want to say for Mr. Rothman, it's been a top priority for you personally for over a decade as a lawmaker, but not only as an activist, as a lawyer. You've been studying this issue specifically in Israel, but also studying other judicial systems from around the world. Why are you so convinced that Israel is desperately in need for a fundamental change to its judicial system?
I have to say, I need to start with two short stories. The first story is the reason that, I don't know if Professor Dershowitz knows, but one of the reasons I chose the path to be a lawyer is him. Meaning, when I read about him and I read about the cases that he took, even cases that, the most famous case, the case in Skokie, is that you go according to the rule of law, against what you think is moral, which he got a lot of criticism, I think. What he basically, you can say if he wants later, but he said this is the rule he should apply. The rule should apply even if all my bones ache when I need to help those terrible people that wanted to shout. It was a neo-Nazi protest near Skokie, where a lot of Holocaust survivors lived. So, and I thought that this is a reason to become a lawyer. This is a reason to invest in the rule of law that is different from what you think is right, what you think is just. It's important because that's what can keep a society together where there are disagreements. This story goes directly to a story. I started Meshilot, the organization, the Israeli Movement for Governability and Democracy, 10 years ago. And I worked on this issue a little bit before. But I think I became more committed in 2015. In 2015, two things happened. One of the Knesset members said that you should go over the Supreme Court with a D9 excavator. I don't know if you remember this quote. Demolished the Supreme Court. It was connected to one of the rulings about Ammona, if I remember correctly. And everyone was very troubled. Some supported, some said it doesn't matter. But it was a very harsh thing to say. It doesn't matter what you think about the case. The other thing happened in quiet. Did not make it to the news. And that was an interview by Chief Justice, then former Chief Justice Aaron Barak. And he was interviewed to one of the law reviews in Israel, of one of Haifa. And the interviewers asked him, what will happen if the court will say something and the government will say something else? It was 2015. I wasn't in government then. It wasn't judicial reform. It wasn't the end of democracy. And Chief Justice Aaron Barak said then something he did not say when he was asked the same question 20 years before. He said, in this case, the army will decide. If the chief of staff will send his tanks to protect the court will prevail. If he will send it to the Knesset will prevail. And I said, if a Knesset member speaks about D9 excavator, and former Chief Justice, who gave a totally different answer a few years ago, is talking about tanks, and by the way, it's against the rule of law to speak like that even, we need to solve this problem, and we need to solve it fast. We cannot status quo, and with this I probably disagree with Professor Dershowitz, status quo is not an option when you get to this kind of tensions.
But you are satisfied from the status quo in Israel?
Well, I don't think the status quo is an option either. Of course, Justice Barak, who I've known since 1966, and have dinner with him every time I go to Israel, as I have dinner with Prime Minister Netanyahu every time I go to Israel. I've known him since 1973, so I know the people on both sides of this. Andrew Jackson said the same thing when the Supreme Court rendered a decision supporting Native Americans in the United States. Jackson said, the court has decided and now let them enforce it. No, that's not the way it should be in Israel, and that's not the way it should be in the United States. There has to be respect for the courts, respect for the judiciary. It has to be self-enforcing. The way for many years it was difficult after Brown versus Board of Education. Half the country did not believe in integrated schools, just the way today half the country doesn't believe that a woman has the right to choose an abortion. And as you said, the rule of law requires you to accept things that you don't believe are necessarily correct, and that includes judicial decisions. Look, I think that the Supreme Court under my dear friend Aaron Barak went too far in a lot of ways. I don't believe that the court should have the power to make decisions about whether the gas deal in Lebanon is permissible, or whether or not there were decisions of the Knesset that are unreasonable, or even whether or not members can serve in the Knesset or serve in the cabinet. Those are political and economic decisions. But there are some areas that the court must have the last word, where we cannot allow democracy to prevail. That is, courts are supposed to be counter-majoritarian. Let me give you one striking example. Free speech. Nobody supports free speech by their enemies. Everybody, every legislature, America, Britain, Israel, would deny dissenters the right to say things like marching in Skokie, Illinois. 99.3% of Americans would have disapproved of that. You need a counter-majoritarian Supreme Court to defend certain rights, free speech, due process for guilty people, due process for accused terrorists. They must have a fair trial. They must have a right to counsel. And if the Knesset won't give that to them, that has to be demanded by the courts. So I think the road to compromise requires that there be limitations on what the Supreme Court can do in areas other than core human rights, core minority rights, core free speech rights. But there have to be constraints on the court when it comes to political, economic, or decisions regarding reasonableness. That's the road to compromise that will permit Israel to thrive as one of the strongest democracies in the world, with a strong judiciary, a strong legislature, a weak president. But the key to democracy, as Learned Hand once said, is democracy will die only when it dies in the hearts of the people. And if it does, no court can save it. And democracy is alive and well in Israel. No matter which way this dispute comes out, democracy will survive and will thrive. Let me just say one more thing. I think the left, the people today who are generally on my side, not necessarily on all matters, but on my side, who are opposing reform, have been using extortionate tactics which have hurt Israel terribly. I think they should not be trying to endanger the economy. They should not be trying to undercut the high-tech community. They should not be trying to undercut the military. And the reason I stopped going to demonstrations of this kind is I think that the people who are opposing judicial reform have been hurting the state of Israel by using these extortionate techniques. I wish they would stop that, let them have debates. There is nothing about this judicial reform that has anything to do with the economy, that has anything to do with high technology, that has anything to do with Israel's ability to defend itself through the military. And I think those areas should be kept out of this debate.
All right, a few issues to break down here. I see where you have some areas of agreement and disagreements. I see when you nod when each other speaks. So let me circle back to one of your earlier points. Simcha, is the court the only thing standing in Israel between majority rule and human rights? In other words, if the judicial reform passes as it stands at the moment, will you, as part of the legislative, have unlimited powers as, you know, opposition to the reform tends to claim?
So before Professor Dershowitz said that he's not the elephant in the room, he's the donkey because he's a Democrat. Maybe I'm not so much into American politics, but probably I need to take the position of the elephant. So there are many things that I wouldn't like any entity of government to have the right to decide. So not the judicial and not the parliament and not the executive, because I like small government, because I am to the right. Having said that, in Israel, the system is very, very to the left. Even the right people in Israel will be considered Democrats in here, most of them. So economically, yes. So it's a different issue a little bit. It's hard to compare. Having said that, the fact that the court is basically limitless, that's a huge problem, and to that I think Professor Dershowitz agrees. To solve I would be able to solve the problem and says, let them just decide issues of human rights. But what is not human rights? What is outside the scope of equality? Any law, almost any law that I know of, someone can make the claim it's unequal. Any law that I can think of takes away property from people. If I want to defend property, let's cancel the IRS. If I want to defend freedom of movement, let's abolish the police because they prevent people from walking into places they shouldn't walk. So you need to have limits on human rights, and every decision you make, everywhere you pass the line, someone would be able to tell you, oh, you did it too much. And that's what happened in the US on many issues. And it's changed over years, and it's changed with politics. What is the limit in Israel? In Israel, and I was a little bit, when Professor Dershowitz spoke about freedom of speech as an example, Israel does not have freedom of speech in its basic laws.
Enshrined in a constitution.
It's not, we don't have a constitution at all. But even if you look at basic laws as a constitution, we don't have freedom of speech. I think freedom of speech in Israel is quite protected compared to many, many, many countries in the world that has freedom of speech in their constitution. So the defense did not come from the constitution. As Professor Dershowitz said, it's come from the hearts of the people. But the court, in 3 different cases, took away freedom of speech from the people that the Knesset gave. When the court canceled the law of Arutz Sheva, where are we sitting now? We are sitting now in a convention, it says here, Arutz Sheva. The Knesset legislated that Arutz Sheva was the only outlet for the right for many, many years will be able to broadcast, giving freedom of speech. Who took this freedom of speech? The court canceled the laws, and the judicial system and the prosecution prosecuted everyone who was involved in Arutz Sheva. while not prosecuting people who were involved in other radio stations.
And the second example?
And the second example, I won't go to the third, really. Thank you for the hint. Just recently, there is a huge corporation in Israel that is funded by the government and broadcast news and media and do podcasts. It's called the Israeli Broadcast Authority. It's getting from taxpayer money almost 1 billion shekels a year. In the US, it would be deemed as hurting the freedom of speech, because the way to shut down other people's speech is to shout very loudly, as we just learned yesterday night. So if you shout with a 1 billion shekel budget, what are the chances of a smaller private-owned radio station or private-owned TV stations? They need to compete in an unfair situation with the government. So the legislator said, let's divide the power there. Let's not have this kind of broadcasting authority that broadcast the news, which is the most delicate issue that you don't want the government to be involved with. The court canceled this law and basically prevented freedom of speech from many, many small players. So the legislator gives freedom of speech in Israel, and the court takes. So to say that the court is a defender of rights, and I wouldn't even start with the examples on criminal procedures, where historically in Israel, legislation is so much more a liberal, progressive, take it wherever you want, than what the courts does, because most of the judges, or not most, many of the judges come from the prosecution, and we have, I will just give one number. I know, I'm sorry about the time. I will just give one number. I just recently discovered during a hearing in the Constitution Committee that I got the numbers of how many wiretaps are being asked by the police every year, and how many the courts approve. Now, only certain judges has the authority to approve. They approve 99.6% of the wiretaps that the police asks. There is another kind of wiretaps from the Shin Bet, from the Shabak, which doesn't go through the court. It goes in a different path. And the head of the Shabak, when he's looking on his own workers after all those inner checks that they have in there, he is canceling more wiretaps in percentage and in numbers than the court. So the court is not. I'm sad to say that in Israel, if you want to look for people to protect your freedom of speech or your freedom of due process in the criminal procedure, don't go to the court, go to the legislator.
Well, no, I think that's wrong. I think what you go to is a system of checks and balances. The great philosopher Montesquieu contributed enormously to democratic theory, which the United States picked up in its Constitution, by creating a system of checks and balances, a system where all power is not in the legislature, all power is not in the judiciary, all power is not in the executive. There are imperfections. And today, for example, the shoe is exactly on the other foot in America. Today, the left wants to weaken the Supreme Court because they don't like its decisions. In Israel, the right wants to weaken the Supreme Court because they don't like its decisions. We're not going to get perfect decisions.
But I have this question.
Say it again?
I have a question here, because both sides here are talking in terms of saving the democracy. And
no, I'm not. Democracy is not going to be in danger either way.
But the system, okay, so the system of checks and balances, is it in place to keep the democracy or keep liberalism? Because I know that Mr. Rotman here, he makes the distinction between the two, democracy and liberalism. So what you're talking about is a system of, saving liberalism?
No, of course not.
No.
The system of checks and balances often saves conservatism, as it does in the United States. The Supreme Court today is checking the liberal legislative actions and liberal actions of some lower courts. Sometimes the right wins, sometimes the left wins. Sometimes the courts are wrong, sometimes the legislature is wrong. The one thing that's absolutely essential is that no branch of government have unlimited power. That's why we need compromise. That's why we need some areas where the courts have the last word. It was Justice Jackson who brilliantly, probably the greatest justice in American history, even greater than Louis Brandeis, great justice, who once said, "We are not final because we are right. We are only right because we are final." And courts are often wrong. I am one of the most strident critics of American courts. I wrote a book called Supreme Injustice, railing against the Supreme Court. If you think your criticism of the Israeli Supreme Court is harsh, read my book. I am a very big critic of the courts. I'm a critic of the legislature. I'm a critic of the presidency. I'm a critic of everybody and everything. And that's why checks and balances are so important, because nobody always wins with checks and balances. Today, the left is prevailing. Tomorrow, the right will prevail. The one thing we have to assure is that no branch of government has the ability to have its will over the minority, over all people. You're right about freedom of speech. These are complicated cases. In the United States, we have Citizens United. The relationship between money and speech is one of the most complex areas of law. But my point is that there has to be an interplay between the legislative branch and the executive branch and the judicial branch. That's why I would like to see a compromise, for example, in some areas. And you're right. It's hard to define what is a human rights issue and what is a property issue. By the way, I wouldn't protect property. I didn't include property or even the freedom of movement. I talked about essentially 2 points, freedom of speech and due process, which are the essential tools of democracy. There's always going to be a dispute between that. Every judicial system has that. The question is, can it be resolved in a way that doesn't give more power to one branch than others? And that's what I think a compromise will bring about, where the Supreme Court has the final word on some issues, but not on other issues. We haven't even had time, and we don't have time, to talk about how you select the justices. That, to me, is the biggest barrier to what's going on in Israel today. When I spoke to all the people, and I've spoken to all the people in Israel, they were all prepared to compromise on this issue of whether override should be permitted on all or only some decisions, what the number should be in override. Where the real problem is in who picks the judges.
Okay. Simcha, before we wrap it up, I have to ask you, negotiators are talking about a compromise now. Many people in Israel are very doubtful that a compromise is actually something within reach. Did you expect the reform to face this huge public backlash as it did? And do you think that this means that a compromise is sort of dead upon arrival, actually?
I think that the issues that Professor Dershowitz just spoke at the end, judges' selection, I think that sums it up. Because you really can agree on anything else. And judges' selection, I believe, I see it, there is a famous method of deciding how to split a cake. So every time when I came to negotiate, I came, and I would do the same with Professor Dershowitz. Whatever rule you want to give the Supreme Court, whatever powers, by all means, I'm signing. You want the court to cancel laws? Okay. You want the court to cancel basic laws? Okay. I appointed judges. And then suddenly everyone understands that, oh, I don't want an entity all-powerful. I believe that in Israel, the left wants to give more power to the courts, not because checks and balances, because the court is unchecked and unbalanced, and there is no decision in Israel that the court cannot make in the current situation. The left wants the court to have this all-powerful, super powerful tools to cancel and make every decision and any appointment and cancel any laws that he sees fit, because when he looks at the judges, he sees people like him or her, and when he looks at the politics, he knows that the public in Israel will never vote for them. So it's not about big issues of jurisprudence or rule of law or democracy. It's about, I want my way to win.
A minority
doesn't
rule.
matter what the outcome of the elections.
I agree. What will happen in Israel is if you get your way and you get to pick all the judges and it suddenly turns extremely, extremely right and the Knesset moves more and more left, we're going to see exactly the same problem with a mirror image. That's why you can't win.
Of course.
You can't win.
That's why.
There has to be a compromise.
Professor Dershowitz.
Yeah.
So you agree that there has to be a compromise?
That's the reason, exactly what you said. That's the reason when from the first draft of the way we appoint our judges that we offered in the Constitution Committee to the last draft, we change it based on those ideas, because I agree that you cannot have the power to appoint all the judges or to pack the court or others. The mechanisms that we introduced, Minister Levin and myself and the heads of the coalition, is saying that no elected Knesset, no elected parliament could appoint more than 2 judges on their own agenda.
That makes sense.
That's now on the table, nothing else.
There were probably 3 people, you, me, and you, who really want to see structural reform for the sake of structural reform. We have differences, but we believe in it as a matter of structural reform. The vast majority of people, including in this audience, they just want to see what's best for their political side. Whichever side comes out, on the conservative side if you're conservative, liberal side you're liberal, we're happy to accept that structure. Very few people in America or in Israel care about process, care about procedure, care about structure. They just want to get it their way. It's becoming worse in Israel. It's almost as bad as it is in the United States. In the United States, it's terrible. Everybody just wants it 100% their way and doesn't want to see any compromise on the other side. I think the Israeli people understand the need for compromise at a time when its national security is endangered by Iran. And I think that if I can come to Israel and help bring about a compromise, if any of us can just bring, and we won't agree, we're not going to agree, we'll walk out angry at each other. But in the end, we can get something that we can live with. And that's the important thing.
Can you grant Mr. Dershowitz an open invitation to come and, maneuver the negotiations around the table at the president's residence?
It means that he will need to add me to his short list. The next time he's in Israel, he will need to have dinner with Chief Justice Aaron Barak, Netanyahu, and myself.
All right. Will there be a reform, yes or no, eventually? Will something change?
As I said in the beginning, I believe status quo is not an option. I believe we need to get to a decent compromise. I think we can do it. The only thing that stops it is what Professor Dershowitz just said. Some parts of Israeli politics, and I'm not pointing fingers, it's the left, does not want to get to a compromise whatsoever. They wouldn't even sign their own bill.
But there are people on the right and the left who don't want compromise.
Okay,
we'll deal with them.
Let's agree over here. All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for this fascinating discussion. Solid arguments on both sides. Thank you so much.